Good morning, students. Welcome back to another Waidsum Academy video. Today we will be learning chapter 14 of biology, coordination and response. So, what do we know about coordination and response? Well, if I clapped my hand very loudly, why do you think you would jump to the response and how your body will react very fast? The reaction will happen in probably milliseconds, and today this chapter is going to explain how your body does that. Coordination and response is about how the body detects changes and processes information and produces a response using systems like the nervous system or hormones. So, what is a stimulus? How does an organism respond to a stimulus? A stimulus is any change in the environment that causes an organism to react, like the way plants grow towards the light. Plants need light for photosynthesis, so they grow towards the light. This response occurs over time. And cockroaches, they move away from the light. They hide in dark areas during the day. The light is the stimulus. It's the change in the environment that causes these organisms to react to that change. What causes our body to respond to our change? Well, there's different types of systems. The two main are the nervous systems and the hormone systems. In today's class, we're going to focus on the nervous system. The nervous system in our body regulates bodily functions and activities, and it coordinates the body response to the stimuli. Stimuli is plural, to stimulus. The nervous system consists of the brain, spinal cord, spinal nerves, and sense organs. The sense organs help our body adjust rapidly to any changes to the environment and enable various body parts. The sense organs are the eyes, ears, nose, and skin. They react to the stimulus, which causes a change, sends a message to our brain or spinal cord, causing a change in action, causes an action in our body. So if I were to clap, the sound of the clap is the stimulus, and your ears are a sense organ which detects the stimulus and sends the message to our brain, sending a message back to our body, causing you to react to the sound. So this is our next section 14.2, the human nervous system. We're going to talk about the two types of nervous system, the CNS, central nervous system, and the PNS, peripheral nervous system. We're going to learn about these two, identify the sensory, relay, and motor neurons, and state what are nerve impulses and why they travel along neurons. Describe a synapse, what is a synapse, and the events that occur in a synapse, and also explain what a simple reflex arc and a reflex action. So what are the two main components of the human nervous system? The human nervous system are made up of two main parts, the CNS and the peripheral. The peripheral is the cranial nerves. You see all these red nerves in the human being, and the spinal nerves close to the spine, the spinal cord. The spinal nerves and the cranial nerves are the nerves closer to the brain, and the spinal nerves are the nerves closer to the spinal cord. And all the nerves, this is what builds up the peripheral nervous system. While the CNS nervous system, the central nervous system, consists of the two main parts, brain and the spinal cord. Do you know why people say we should protect the brain and the spinal cord? Because these two parts build the central nervous system, which are very important to our bodily functions. They are what causes our body to react. They are what send the messages to the motor neurons to cause us to react to anything. So this system right here is the main part of the entire coordination and response. The receptors, which send nerves to the central nervous system, which send nerves to the effectors. Now the central nervous system could be the spinal cord or the brain. The stimulus, the receptor they react to the stimulus, sending a message through the nerves to the central nervous system, which sends a message through the effectors. This entire diagram, this entire pathway explains what the coordination and response is all about. So now we're going to be going to the neuron diagrams. Neuron are the pathway. You see these nerves? They are the pathway to what the receptors send the messages to the central nervous system. This pathway, these nerves, are called the neuron diagrams. The neurons. There are three main types of neurons: sensory, relay, and motor. Sensory neurons carry a nerve impulses from the sense organs to the CNS. So these receptors are considered the sense organs. And when they send a message to the CNS, it's called the sensory neuron. It's what the sensory neuron carries impulses from the sense organ to the CNS, brain or spinal cord. This is the sense neuron. So you see this entire area? This entire part is called the sensory neuron. Whereas the relay neuron are found inside the CNS. So inside the CNS alone, only the CNS alone has the relay neuron. So just this area has a neuron on its own called the relay neuron. The relay neuron are what connects the sensory neuron to the motor neuron. They are what send the messages, transform the sensory neuron messages all the way to the motor neuron messages. The motor neuron is from the central nervous system, which is the brain or spinal cord, all the way to the effectors. This is the motor neuron. After receiving the message from the receptors, it reacts to those messages by sending it through the motor neuron. So we have the three main parts of neurons: sensory, relay, and motor. These are what build the main sensory background, the main nervous system background. So neurons have long. We'll go to what neurons are. Neurons have what are neurons? Neurons have long fibers, which are considered the axons. They're built something like this, where they will have the main cell body and the axon terminals. This is what nerve impulses travel through to send the messages. When the receptor receives a receptor receives a stimulus, it sends the messages through the nerves, which are known as neurons. The nerve impulses travel through the neurons, going through the central nervous system and so on. So nerve impulses move very fast. They're electrical energy. They move through the neurons. That means less time is wasted by transferring the impulse from one cell to another. And the neurons are covered by the axon, which is an insulated. The axon is covered by the insulated fatty sheets, which have small sections along it called the nodes. Yeah, here's a perfect example. This is an example of a neuron. As you can see, here is a motor neuron, here's a sensory neuron, and here's the relay neuron. This entire part is the nervous system, central nervous system. While here's the sensory neuron, and here's the motor neuron. And inside the central nervous system, we have the relay neuron. Now, this entire diagram is considered a neuron, where we have the axon. This tiny pink line that goes through is called an axon, and this yellow thing that covers the axon is considered a myelin sheath. It's an insulated fat that covers the axon as the nerve impulses travel through. And these small gaps between each myelin sheath are called nodes of Ranvier, but for now we call them nodes. As the lower secondary call them, the grade 10 and 11 we call them nodes. But as you move on, they're considered nodes of Ranvier. So we're going to go to, now that we understand the diagram, the building of a neuron, we're going to learn what a synapse is. A synapse is a tiny junction between two neurons. You see these neurons, between the sensory relay neuron, there are small gaps. The neurons are not connected. There are small gaps in between. These gaps are called the synapse, and the nerve impulse travels through the synapse, through the gaps. They travel through the gaps of the synapse. So how are nerve impulses transmitted across a synapse? Well, it begins here when the nerve impulse, an impulse travels along the sensory neuron until it arrives at the synapse. When it does so, the impulse causes the synaptic vessels to move towards the membrane of the neuron. These synaptic vessels contain chemicals known as neurotransmitters. So as the impulse arrives here, it arrives at the synaptic, you see these small green dots? These are the nerve's impulse. They arrive at the synaptic vessel. They enter inside a synaptic vessel. And these synaptic vessels contain chemicals known as neurotransmitters. The vessels, they fuse with the presynaptic membrane, releasing neurotransmitters. So as they move close to the end, you see this line here. This line is considered the presynaptic membrane. And as the synaptic vessel fuses with this presynaptic membrane, it releases the neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters are what travel through the synapse. They diffuse across the synaptic gap, moving from a high concentration to a low concentration. They diffuse across the synaptic gap. And when they arrive at the postsynaptic membrane, they come from the presynaptic membrane to the postsynaptic membrane. As they arrive to the postsynaptic membrane, these neurotransmitters bind with the receptor proteins on the membrane of the next neuron, known as the postsynaptic membrane. Then an impulse is generated in the next neuron and it moves on. This simple step explains how a nerve impulse travels from one sensory neuron to another neuron, the relay neuron. Here is where the central nervous system lies, and here is where the receptors lie. They send the message from the nerve impulse. The receptors send a nerve impulse, which is a message and they travel through the sensory neuron, arriving at the synaptic gap. Then from there on, they go to the relay neuron, and this explains how the synapse is. Looking at this diagram, you could explain. It shows how the nerves arrive at the end of a presynaptic neuron, and then the vesicles move towards and fuse with the presynaptic membrane. The synaptic vesicles move towards and fuse with the presynaptic membrane, which releases neurotransmitters into the synaptic gap, which is called the synaptic cleft. The neurotransmitters diffuse across the synaptic cleft down a concentration gradient. So it goes from high concentration to low concentration. Then the neurotransmitters attach to the receptors of the synaptic membrane. This triggers an impulse which travels along the postsynaptic neuron, which is considered the relay neuron. Then from there on, the nerve impulse travels through the relay neuron, arriving at the motor neuron and repeating this entire process. Neurons never touch each other, which is true. The gaps between these neurons are called the synapse. Then the electrical impulse the nerve impulses travel along the first axon, which they arrive at the presynaptic neuron, which releases the chemical called the neurotransmitters, which fuse with the presynaptic membrane. The neurotransmitters then diffuse across the synaptic gap and bind with the receptor molecules on the membrane of the second neuron, which is known as the postsynaptic membrane. This is called the postsynaptic membrane, the edge of this neuron. The neurotransmitters are then destroyed yeah, you can hear, as you can hear, listen here, they say the neuron transmitters are then destroyed to prevent continued stimulation. So to prevent another creation of another nerve impulses, because when the neuron transmitters arrive at the postsynaptic neuron, they create the nerve impulses again. So to prevent the neuron transmitter to create more nerve impulses, they get destroyed. So therefore, only the one exact copy of the nerve impulse traveled through the postsynaptic neuron. So why all this complicated process? Why do nerve impulses travel to synaptic gaps? Well, the main reason is because this synaptic gap allows the nerve impulses. These synaptic gaps allow the nerve impulses to travel in only one direction. The entire point of this gap is to prevent the nerve impulses from moving backwards in the neurons, to move backwards. So this entire synaptic gap allows the nerve impulses to only travel in one direction, avoiding confusion within the nervous system. And this is the only part of the entire nervous system which are containing chemical messages, because the neuron transmitters that are in the vesicles are considered chemical. The neuron transmitters created in these vesicles are considered chemical. So how does the nervous system process information? Well, as I said, this main pathway is very important for many students to understand. When you touch something very hot or very cold, you can feel it. This is because the temperature receptors in your skin, as you know, there are many sense organs. Sense organs such as eyes, nose, skin, ears, and so on. When the sense organs contain receptors in the sense organs, this allows the sense organs to detect any change made in the receptors. For example, when we touch something very hot, you can feel the heat in your skin. This is because the temperature receptors in your skin are stimulated. Impulses are produced and they move through the sensory neuron to go all the way to the brain, from the sensory neuron all the way to the CNS, which is the brain. From there, it goes from the relay neuron inside the brain or spinal cord. Remember, the CNS is built of brain or spinal cord, so it doesn't have to necessarily go to the brain. It can go to the spinal cord instead. It goes to the spinal cord or brain, goes through the spinal cord, which arrives at the CNS system. From the CNS, it arrives at the brain, which causes our brain to interpret these impulses and give us a sensation, a feeling of the stimulus. For sensations, the temperature receptors in the skin detect the stimulus. Impulses are produced and they travel through the sensory neuron and through the relay neuron in the spinal cord. This entire part is called the CNS, the central nervous system. The sensory neuron sends the nerve impulses through the relay neuron, and from the relay neuron, it goes to the brain, and the brain interprets these impulses and gives us a sensation, a feeling. That's how we feel the heat of when we touch something hot, or feels the coldness when you touch something cold. Now, what about voluntary actions? Voluntary actions is when we do something we want to do. A voluntary action is a deliberate action, means that it happens under our conscious control, means that we want to do something, then our brain knows we want to do it and we do it. Example, when you want to stand up, when you're sitting down and you want to stand up, this is considered a voluntary action. Your brain forms this message that it wants to stand up, sending nerve impulses to the relay neuron to the spinal cord. From there, it sends this nerve impulse to the motor neuron. Then from the motor neuron, it goes to the effector, which is your legs. From there, your legs change its position, it moves, it stands, allowing you to stand up. Now we're going to learn for what a reflex arc are. What is a reflex arc? To start with, a reflex arc is the shortest pathway by which a nerve impulse travels from the receptor to the effector in a reflex action. So, there's two types of reflex arcs: voluntary responses and reflex responses. We'll go into these two. What are voluntary responses? A voluntary response is when you make a conscious decision. That means your brain knows what you want to do. You know what you want to do, and you carry out a particular action. So therefore, voluntary responses or voluntary actions start from the brain. They do not start from the receptors in the sense organs. They start from the brain because you want to do something. For example, reaching out to pick up a cup of coffee. So your brain sends these messages through the relay neuron in the spinal cord. Then from there it sends the message all the way to the motor neuron, which goes to the effector. In this case, your effector is your hand. So your hand moves to grab the cup of coffee. This entire example is considered a voluntary response. An involuntary response, or example, a reflex response, is when your brain does not know what it's doing. It reacts before you are aware of what has happened. This is an automatic and a rapid response to a stimulus, which is touching something very sharp or hot, something that your brain jerks. When you touch something like painful, sharp, or hot, your brain jerks. It does not involve the brain though. That's why a reflex response is quicker. A reflex response does not involve the brain as the coordinator, and you're not aware of it you have completed until after you have carried it out. These reflex responses are faster than voluntary responses, and they are what causes us to jerk or react to something really quick. Like when we touch something really hot, our body quickly reacts to it and removes our hands from the heat. These reflexive responses are considered rapid, whereas voluntary responses often take longer. So what is a reflex action? We're going to go to a reflex action real quick. A reflex action is an immediate response, aka reflex response. The brain and spinal cord are reflex centers. Reflex actions are classified as follows: cranial reflexes and spinal reflexes. Cranial reflexes are considered from the brain, controlled by the brain, involuntary, while the spinal reflexes are controlled by the spinal cord. Example of a cranial reflexes is when we shine light into our eyes. When we do so, our brain quickly reacts by sending a message to the eye pupil, making it to contract or expand. While in the spinal reflexes, they're controlled by the spinal cord. Like sometimes when a doctor uses a hammer to hit your kneecap or the tendon, the knee jerk, the way you react causes is an example of a spinal reflex. So when you hit a hammer in your knee, the jerking, the way your legs move up, is caused by a spinal reflex. Now what happens when you touch something hot? This is an example of a reflex response. What happens when you touch something hot? 1. The receptors in your skin, the skin is considered a sense organ. The receptors in your skin stimulate the nerve endings and impulses are produced. So the heat of the object stimulates the nerve receptors and impulses are produced. Then from there it travels to the sensory neuron, which transmits the impulses to your spinal cord. As you can see, this is the sensory neuron. The nerve impulses travel from here all the way to the spinal cord. Here it hits the synapse. This part is called the relay neuron, and you can see the synaptic gap. As the nerve impulse is traveling, it goes through the synaptic gap, arriving at the relay neuron. Then from the relay neuron, it sends the message to the spinal cord. The spinal cord are the nerve impulses are transmitted first across the synapse to the relay neuron. Then from there it's translated and moved from the relay neuron to the motor neuron. The spinal cord is where this nerve impulse is translated. It makes your spinal cord understand what the issue is and how it's going to react. Then from there, this nerve impulses in the relay neurons travel to the synaptic gap to the motor neuron. Then from there, it travels through this motor neuron, transmitting the nerve impulses all the way to the effector, which is your hand, causing your hand to jerk. See, here's the original position. As you touch something hot, it jerks. This entire process doesn't take up to a millisecond. This entire pathway, this entire movement of the nerve impulse does not take up to a millisecond, causing you to react really quickly. So when you put your hand on something hot, your hand immediately reacts. That is because the nerve impulse has already gone to the spinal cord, traveled to the motor neuron, and through your hand to your hand. So what is a reflex arc? A reflex arc, as I've said, is the shortest pathway by which a nerve impulse travels from the receptor to the effector in the reflex action. So this is the shortest path, making it very quick. Like a reflex response, a reflex arc is very rapid, really extremely fast. It's not like voluntary responses. The receptor in our sense organs travel to the sensory neuron, arriving at the relay neuron, going to the motor neuron to the effector. This entire part is called a reflex arc. So how is a reflex action different from a voluntary action? This is really important for IGCSE students or O-level students. We need to understand the difference between a reflex action and a voluntary action. A reflex action is something rapid, something fast, something that you do not have control over. It happens automatically or not under conscious control. While voluntary action, you know what is happening. It happens under conscious control, and your brain, it starts the impulse, the nerve impulse. The messages are created in your brain, not collected from your receptors in your sense organs. Reflex actions are immediate or quick and are considered rapid, while voluntary actions they're quite slow. They're not very slow, because when you say slow, don't automatically assume it takes hours. It's just that reflex action occur under a millisecond, while voluntary action takes around a second or so to react. A specific stimulus is required, but a specific stimulus is not required. You see, in reflex action, your receptors in your sense organs need to require a stimulus, and it needs to be specific. Example, when you touch something hot, your reflex action occurs. But in a voluntary action, you do not need to touch anything, you do not need to feel anything, your receptors do not need to collect any stimulus. Rather, your brain forms the nerve impulses. As you can see, nerve impulses are produced in the brain. They are formed in the brain, and from there on moves to the effector. While reflexes are produced by the receptor in reflex action. Nerve impulses are produced by the receptor in reflex action. So here are some questions. Let's practice. You can take a moment to pause this video and answer these questions. Using an example, distinguish between a stimulus and a response. 2. What are the components of the nervous system? And 3. State the names of the 3 kinds of neurons. So you need to pause this video and please answer this question, as you're benefiting yourself when you solve questions like this. So we'll move on to 4.3. We should talk about the sense organs. The sense organs are groups of organs that consist receptor cells, which allow them to respond to specific stimuli. Stimuli is plural of stimulus. There are different types of sense organs, such as the eyes, ears, nose, your skin. These are all sense organs. But the specific sense organ we're going to be talking about today is your eye. The eye has receptor cells that respond to light, while the nose has receptor cells that respond to smells. The tongue has receptor cells that respond to taste. The ears have receptor cells that respond to sound, and the skin has receptor cells that respond to touch, temperature, and pain. But today we're just going to, this diagram explains all of them: the eye, nose, tongue, skin, and ear, and each have specific receptors that respond to a specific stimulus. So today's topic, though, today's sense organ we're going to learn about is the eye. The eye is considered the window of your soul. It's what lets us see colors, lights, dim lights. But how do we see? Well, in humans, each eyeball lies in a hollow in the skull called the orbit. Each eyeball is attached to the skull by rictus muscles, and the rictus muscles control the eye movement. Now, what is the structure of the eye? Well, right on top this is not really a good diagram, but right on top of your eye there's a tear gland. The tear gland is in charge of producing tears when you cry. Then this is the eye. Then outside in the eye we have different parts, such as the suspensorial ligament, which is a connective tissue that attaches the edge of the lens to the ciliary body. We have the cornea, which is a dome-shaped transparent layer that is continuous with the sclera. The sclera, the cornea refracts or bends light rays into the eye. As light is moving through, it refracts the eye or bends it, causing it to hit the optic nerve. Then we have the lens. This important part. The lens acts like a window. The lens acts like a window. It's a transparent, circular, and biconvex structure. It is elastic and it changes shapes or thickness in order to focus the light into the retina. Light travels through the retina, my bad way. As light is traveling through, it goes from the lens, it bends, and it refracts and bends into the retina. We also have the blind spot, which is the optic nerve. This is the blind spot. You see this area is the blind spot. It's where the optic nerves leave the eye, and it does not contain any rods or cones, and therefore it's not sensitive to light. But hold up, what is rods and cones? We'll get to that in a minute. There are many parts of the eye which have important functions to allowing us to see, such as the ciliary muscle, the sclera. This is the sclera. This blue line around the eye is the sclera. The retina, the fovea, optic nerve consisting of the blind spot, the iris, cornea, pupil, lens, and so on. So here are you don't have to memorize all this in parts, but you should memorize some, most of them. Cornea, iris, lens, retina, optic nerves are the most important part, well, the most important part of the eyes. The cornea is a transparent covering at the front of the eye that allows the eye to reflect. The iris are the muscles that controls how much light enters the pupil. Here's the iris. It's what gives you your the color in your eye. The lens are transparent discs that changes shape to focus light onto the retina, and the retina are a layer of light receptor cells. Here is where the receptor of the eye lies. This is where they are. So light is reflected or refracted or bent to focus in the retina. The optic nerve is considered a blind spot and does not consist of any excuse me, my mouse. Okay, it does not consist of any part. The optic nerve does not consist of any receptors. Now, what are photoreceptors? Photoreceptors are receptors in the retina consisting of rods and cones. There are receptors that detect light. You should understand that in biology, photo means light. Photosynthesis, photoreceptors, and so on. Photo means light in biology. Photoreceptors are receptors that detect light, and they are mainly located in the retina of the eyes. And they consist of two main parts, rods and cones. Now, as you can see in the diagram, these are cones and these are rods. And you can see these are neurons, sensory neurons. So when these rods and cones receive light, they create impulses, nerve impulses that travel through the sensory neuron, moving all the way to the brain or the relay neuron. So what are cones and rods, and what are the difference between these two? Well, cones are what enable us to see colors in bright light. You know, when you look at a rainbow or something colorful, you notice that each has different colors, each shade: orange, red, yellow, green, blue, purple, violet, and so on. The cone allows us to see colors in bright light. But in dark light, in dim light, they cannot allow us to see any colors. That's why when you enter a dark room, everything is black. You can't see colors. That's because in dim light, cones cannot work well. While in rods, they enable us to see in dim light, but only black and white. Rods are sensitive to dim light. So rods, when you enter a dark room, the rods allow us to see in the dark room. They are what collect the dim light and send it to the sensory turn it to the sensory neuron, allowing us to see in dark light. So when people have eye problems in the pigments in the cones can cause color blindness. You can see between these two images, the left here has normal vision. You can see everything in normal colors and everything has its own different color and shade. But with color blindness, which is called red-green color blindness, which is a common type of color blindness, everything else seems the same type of shade. Everything here looks orange, yellow, and brown. That is because there's problems with the pigments in the cones, which causes color blindness. So what's a pupil reflex? A pupil reflex is a type of reflex action, aka a reflex response, that happens rapidly. As you can remember, we talked about rapid reflex responses. These are responses that happen very quickly. When the right amount of light enters the eye, when the right amount of light enter the right amount of light must enter through the eye in order for a person to see clearly. The size of the pupil determines how much light enters the eye. So you see this pupil is a black spot in between your iris. When in bright light, the pupil dilates. The iris responds by making this pupil smaller. This reduces the amount of light entering the eye. And in dark light, the pupil increases in size. It becomes larger. This increases the amount of light entering the eye. So how does the iris is actually in charge of controlling the amount of light entering the eye. The circular muscles of the iris contract. Then the radial muscles of the iris relax when there's a lot of bright light. So then the pupil becomes smaller. It constricts. It constricts and becomes smaller. This reduces the amount of light entering the eye. So when you're looking at something really bright, your iris, the circular muscles of your iris contract and the radial muscles relax, the radial. And these are making the pupil in your eye look smaller or constrict. However, in dim light, the radial muscles of your iris contract and the circular relaxes, therefore making the pupil enlarge or dilate, increasing the amount of light entering the eye. So this is something you should memorize, as it will, trust me, will come in your Igcse exams or any exams. As a matter of fact, as long as you're doing this topic, coordination and response, you should memorize this table. Remember, in dim light, radial muscles contract, while in bright light, radial muscles relax, and it's opposite for the circular muscles. In dim light, circular relaxes, and in bright light, the circular muscles contract. The pupil becomes small in dim light. It becomes big in dim light and becomes small in bright light. And the light entering your eye becomes more in dim light, allowing us to see, and becomes less in bright light, allowing us to see less, protecting our eyes. This entire process is actually can be considered a type of coordination and response process, because when light, how does the iris control the amount of light entering the eye? When the light enters the eye, the iris, which is the effector, the light enters the eye, the receptor in the retina is stimulated, sending a nerve impulses through the sensory neuron, going through the relay neuron in the brain, then returning back through the motor neuron, transmitting impulses from the brain to the iris, and the iris is the effector. This is an example of coordination and response. So stimulus change in eye light intensity, which goes to the receptor, collects this information, the stimulus, and produces nerve impulses. The nerve impulses travel to the sensory neuron, then arrives at relay neurons in the brain. Then from the brain goes to the motor neuron, which arrives at the effector, which is the iris. Now this is the end of section 14.3. And here is a question. Outline the processes that take place in the pupil reflex when you leave a brightly lit room and enter a dark room. Name the receptor and effector involved. So please pause this video, solve it, and practice. It's what makes you become better. Now, how do we see? Now that we've understand how our eye controls the amount of light that enters the eye, the iris, we need to learn about how do we actually see. How does light enter our eyes and the brain forms the image? How does this happen? Well, when light rays from a distant object enter our eyes, the ciliary muscles relax, pulling on suspensory ligaments. So, to remember, the suspensary ligament is a connective tissue that attaches the edge of the lens to the ciliary body. So when light enters, the ciliary muscles relaxes, pulling on the suspensary ligaments, and the suspensary ligaments become taut, pulling on the edges of the lens. This is the ledge, and this is the suspensary ligament. When light enters, the ciliary muscles relax, causing the ciliary ligaments, these small strands that are holding the lens, they pull the lens. They become taut, causing the lens to become thinner or thinner. The lens becomes thinner and less convex, increasing its focal length. The focal length is the distance between the middle of the lens and the point of the focus of the retina. So this distance between the lens and the retina is called the focal length. And it is from the focal length that you could learn the light travels from the lens to the retina, which consists of the receptors. The light rays from the distant objects are sharply focused on the retinas, and photoreceptors are stimulated. And the nerve impulses that are stimulated by the photoreceptors travel through the brain, and the brain interprets these impulses, and the person sees the object. The brain creates the image. So what happens when the image, the light source, or what we want to see is closer? Because this process is for objects that are very distant. For objects that are quite close, the ciliary muscles contract, making the suspensary ligaments slacken. The lens therefore becomes thicker and more convex. And when you focus on the, oh my god, excuse me, sorry, my mouse is bugging. Okay, it's lag. The lens becomes thicker and more convex, decreasing its focal length. And when the focal length is decreased, the light rays from the near object are sharply focused on the retina, and photoreceptors are stimulated. These nerve impulses go to the brain, and the brain interprets these impulses as a object really closer, and the person sees the near object. So these two processes explain how we see far objects and near objects. When a person has damaged the lens or the suspensary ligaments or even the ciliary muscles, we become unable to see far or close objects. That is why sometimes the lens can't really do their work. Some people wear glasses. The lens from the glasses allow the rays to refract and change and refract and arrive at the retina, where the photoreceptors are located in. And this is the end of the coordination and response, aka the nervous system. Here, as you can see, is a whole table, which is this nervous system. Let's do this together. The nervous system is made up of two parts, which is the CNS and the PNS, peripheral and central nervous system. The CNS consists of the brain and the spinal cord, while the PNS consists of the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. The cranial nerves the peripheral consists of the sense organs and the nerves. The sense organs have receptors that they detect a stimuli and produce nerve impulses, which are traveled by the sensory neuron which goes through from the sensory neuron. It travels through the motor neuron. No, sorry, it's sensory neuron. It travels through the CNS, which is the central nervous system, and in the central nervous system, it has the relay neuron, which then travels to the motor neuron, arriving at the effector. And you should also understand that in between neurons, there are synaptic gaps, synapse, which allows the neurons to travel forward in one direction. And it travels the synapse through a chemical called the neurotransmitters. And then we have the eye. How in bright light, the bright light, in bright light the pupil becomes small. In bright light, the circular muscles of the iris contract, the radial muscles of the iris relax, and the pupils become small, allowing less light to enter. And in dim light, the radial muscles of the iris contract, the circular muscles of the iris relax, and making the pupil become larger, allowing more light to enter the eyes. And when focusing on distant objects, that means objects that are very further away. When you're focusing on an object that is distant, the ciliary muscles relax, pulling on the suspensorial ligaments. The suspensorial ligaments become taut, which means it be stretched, pulling on the lens, causing the lens to become thinner. And therefore, the focal length of between the lens and the retina increases. And the opposite can be said for the near objects. In near objects, the ciliary muscles contract, causing the suspensorial ligaments to slack and the lens to become thicker and more convex. So here is the full diagram. Here is everything, as you can see. Central nervous, peripheral nervous, receptors, which are sense organs, and nerves. The nerves are where the nerves input travel. The receptors are what are sense organs. Receptors lies in sense organs. Sense organs such as the eye. The eye is one of them, a famous example. There's more such as the nose, ears, tongue, and even our skin can all be considered as sense organs. And this is the end of the coordination and response chapter. We've learned about the eye, the reflex arc, the difference between reflex responses and voluntary responses. We have also learned about the types of sense organs and also learned about the reflex arc, the central and peripheral nervous system, and more about the types of neurons. And this is it for this video. If you understood this class and you want to learn more, there's more videos in Waidsum Academy channel. And thank you so much for listening to this class, and we'll see you on the next time. Bye bye.